Today I'm going to be talking about composition in manga and comics. I'm Kai, a 19-year-old artist from the UK, currently working on a one-shot with Viz. First we'll talk about the most basic thing that you would learn if you're looking to get into composition, and that would be the rule of thirds, which is basically just these two horizontal and two vertical lines, essentially. So these would be essentially focal points. The lines don't have to be perfect or anything, but essentially these would be focal points in a scene. Essentially you would put important information in here. For example, in manga and comics it would be, let's say someone was talking and they was in the scene. I mean, typically you want to leave a little bit of headroom, so probably like this. And you would put a speech bubble in one of these focal points too, because speech bubbles are also part of the composition. And something that you want to think about when you sort of put down compositions in general and put down your storyboards. I mean, you wouldn't want your character like offset on the page like this and two characters talking like this. Essentially you always want your character to be touching the focal point, or in some specific cases they don't need to, which is probably what I'll talk about later. But essentially this sort of composition technique works in, you know, any sort of shape of a panel that you might draw. For example, like this, you can put a head in here, you can put a head in here. And it's going to be a lot more interesting than if you put two characters side by side. Regardless of if they was in a composition or not, it's going to look a lot more interesting if two characters like this. Just having a character in the foreground is always going to be a lot more interesting than having them side by side. But it doesn't just apply to that too. It also applies to if you're drawing, you know, far away scenes where a character is standing there. You know, you might have something in the foreground and, you know, they're walking like so. It's going to be a lot more interesting than if your character was offset either way. Sometimes the center is also a focal point too, because you might draw an important character close up there. You'll see this technique used in movies and comics a lot specifically. In manga it's more subtle, but it's definitely there if you're looking for it. So again, you would put a speech bubble in here, you might put a character down here, you might put a character further back. You know, you could essentially do anything with it. Even if your focal point isn't, for example, a character. If your focal point was people in a car, you could also do that, like this. And it would work just the same. Essentially, you just want your focal point, i.e. what people should be looking at, to be in these points specifically. Next, I'll talk a little bit about foreground and background, which is something that you would want to keep in mind. For example, this shot here, it works how it is, but sometimes if two characters are talking, you might want a character in the foreground like so, and it's going to make the composition a lot more interesting because you can tell that they're looking at someone. But this character here can be as large or small as you want them, as long as they're sort of in front of this character. For example, they can be really big like this, or they could be really small and you would see more of them this way. But essentially, as long as they're in front of this character here, it works. Essentially what you want to do with this is this helps you frame the shot a lot more. So you could put your speech bubbles here if you want, and like that. And since the speech bubbles are pointing towards the character, it's gonna give them a lot more attention on the page too. You wouldn't want the character in the foreground to be talking, because then you might as well flip the canvas or flip these two positions and make this character go in the foreground. Additionally, you can use things in the foreground to frame shots. For example, if you wanted to, you could draw a tree here. We'll get rid of this car, and we could draw a tree to frame the character shot here. And it brings more attention to the character here because this is all one shape, or it will be perceived as one shape, especially if you change the contrast, which is essentially the value of it. For example, if I put this thing in the foreground and I made it black, in comparison to sort of this part here, this would be super light, so this would instantly be where people look, because this would be seen as one big shape, so essentially it won't attract that much attention. It also works with your basic characters too, like this guy here. we might want to change his value like this. And with manga, you'd be able to do this with screen tone. I think you might see this a lot if you read a lot of manga. The foreground characters usually, or sometimes depending on the mangaka, he's screen toned out, and maybe they use thicker screen tones for this kind of thing. Essentially, this is going to make your compositions a lot more interesting in general. You don't need a specific reason to do it or not to do it. It really just depends on you and how you want to approach it. You'll see it used a lot in movies, and you'll see it used a lot in comics too. Mangas use it too, occasionally. When you're working on your compositions too, it's important to sort of put in backgrounds. Typically, if people think composition or manga, comic, movie, whatever looks really good, it's typically because they have good backgrounds. If you think of you think of Vagabond, you think of Ghibli movies, when people look at things and say that it looks really good, a lot of the time the scenery is really nice, and the shots that they use are really nice too, how they set things up. So being able to implement specific things can be very important to depend on the sort of style you're trying to go for. So essentially, if I was going to make a new composition here, there's a few techniques I could use to sort of make the character stand out and make the scene more interesting. Beginners typically don't draw backgrounds or draw very minimal backgrounds because it's very difficult for them to do, and I do get that, but if you learn to do this, it's going to make your stuff a lot more interesting for people who are reading, which is, your goal is for people to enjoy reading your stuff as you make it. So being able to sort of put these things down and make it interesting for a reader is super important. So essentially, you could use what's called sort of leading lines. Put simply, imagine if you had a 1-point perspective, like so. You could put your character on top of this 1-point perspective here, and then naturally, everything that, like all the backgrounds here, everything would point directly towards the character, and so the character would really stand out in that space. And that's something that you can do with essentially anything, and you can make it very interesting that way. Let's say we had someone here, just a character. As you can see, with the character stand out, it's not a very interesting shot or composition or anything, but depending on what you add around the character, it's going to make the shot a lot more interesting. For example, here I'll add in some. And we'll put something in the foreground to frame the shot, and also change the contrast on what's in the foreground here. As you can see, all the leading lines point directly towards the character, and that's going to make them stand out a lot more. In addition, if you change the character's contrast and you make them sort of a darker character, maybe they're holding an umbrella or something to hide their face, like so, and it makes them look a little more sinister. They're going to stand out a lot more in the scene. Essentially, having the background take up a portion of the space is also going to be helpful. Naturally, like I just talked about, having it be a different sort of contrast can be very helpful for making your character stand out. But essentially, a lot of the backgrounds can also follow the rules of big, medium, small, which is essentially you have one big thing in the canvas, you have one medium thing, and then you have a super small thing. And in addition to them being different sizes, they can also be different shapes. So if you have a square, which is the big shape, or it could be, the triangle, the circle, anything could be the big shape, but for this, the big shape would be the square, the medium shape might be the circle, and then the small shape would be the triangle. And the small shape might be the character, so the medium shape might be other background stuff, and then the square could be, something large in the scene. Maybe something in the foreground, or something that is naturally just big, maybe a tower, something like that. So essentially having these littler shapes when you're drawing can really make your scene stand out a lot more too. Naturally, having your shots at different angles too can be very helpful. So if you're shooting a shot from above, then that can be a lot more interesting than shooting straight on all the time. But you don't have to force yourself to always draw in perspective, because you can make it work even if you don't essentially use a lot of different angles and perspectives, as long as things are varied enough on each panel and page for them to work, or they're varied enough so that they do work. So essentially, if you was going to do a shot from above, it might be a doorway, like so, and the doorway might be what's in the foreground. So I would also make it darker, like so, and we might have a character like this. In addition, for me personally, in this angle, I'd also use some leading lines to, bring the character more into the focal point. Occasionally, if you're using leading lines, or the character is prominent enough in the scene, you might not need to use the rule of thirds, which is kind of how composition is. Even though these rules do exist, they're pretty much there to be broken. You can find a lot of different creative ways to not use the rule of thirds and still make a scene very interesting. Essentially, putting some kind of floor down is better too. But this is essentially how I would approach it. Essentially, what I'll talk about next is sort of a composition within a composition. I guess we've been doing this pretty much the whole time anyway, with the things we've been putting in the foreground. But essentially, I think a cool way to think of composition is like this. Let's say you had something in the foreground. This right here would be the new sort of canvas or composition itself. Like originally the whole square would be the drawing area, but essentially only this becomes the drawing area. So for me, sometimes I think of the rule of thirds only within this quarters here. So I might put a character over here rather than right in the center, which would be somewhere around here. It can change a little depending on how you're approaching it, and I think that's what makes composition specifically very interesting, because you can pick up on a lot of things that you personally like that others might not use or agree with, but these are definitely techniques that a lot of different comic artists and manga artists use, so being able to implement them yourself is very helpful. So essentially, this is how you might approach that, still with the leading lines. Essentially, when you do composition, you want to mix a lot of these different elements together, and then it creates an even more interesting composition in general. Other things you could do, very super small things, is making a character do something that they that's different than the ordinary. For example, typically what you might see in a lot of comics, manga, is essentially if a lot of NPCs are walking this way, then we would leave a space in the composition for as you can see in the rule of thirds, for the main character to be, and they would be going in the opposite direction of everyone else who is going this way, and that would make them stand out a lot more too. You might want to change specifically how they look to compared to everyone else. Since everyone else is pretty average, this guy will have his hood up and things like that, and that will help them stand out a lot more too. Like so. There are a lot of other ways to implement this too, because this is a technique that they just need to be standing out in some kind of way and doing something different than everyone else is doing to stand out. So essentially it's gonna you don't necessarily need to follow the rule of thirds in some cases when it comes to a lot of these things. So something to keep in mind. And when it comes to putting all of these together, what's important to do is to make sure that you vary your shots enough. So essentially, it's all fine and good to talk about the specific ways to do a composition, but you want to make your compositions different enough on each page that they don't feel the same, and there's not too much, maybe too much backgrounds or not enough varied shots. So essentially, a mistake that a lot of beginners make is that they use the same shot so many times that it becomes repetitive and boring. So instead, what you want to do is, have a basic rule set of how you approach pages, and decide your intentions with each page that you're drawing. For example, first of all, if you're starting a new scene, then you want an establishing shot, which is essentially going to be an overall shot of the whole sort of where the characters are. For example, if they're in a school, we're going to show the school. If they're in a building, we're going to show the building. If they're outside a building, we're going to show the outside the building. You get the point. So essentially, establishing shots is to show where the character is in the space. So that's what you want to do as your first shot, typically. Sometimes you could do it as your second or third shot. But for beginners, I would say start off as basic as you can get, which is establishing shots on, the first thing. And then you want to establish your intentions with sort of the page itself. So, what kind of feelings are you trying to invoke with the page? How much detail do you want to show? Things like that. When you don't really need to draw backgrounds all the time because the page can feel very cluttered, which is something that you want to avoid too. So you got to decide when to show backgrounds and when to hide them. Especially with manga, because I feel like a lot of mangas avoid drawing backgrounds anyway. If you look at Dragonball or at least Shonen's, there are some examples of more seinen manga drawing a lot more backgrounds. For example, if you look at Vagabond or you look at Oyasumi Punpun, you'll find a lot of backgrounds in those kinds of mangas, more specifically. So essentially, you want to start with some kind of establishing shot. Then you want to vary the panels, basically how you're paneling. I have a video on paneling, so you can go check that out after this one if you don't know how to do paneling. So essentially, you want to put down the paneling like this, or as varied as you can possibly get with the paneling. Then you want to vary the shots as much as you can. Use all the techniques you learned here and figure out different ways to put down different shots. And then after that, keep what you put inside the panels, keep that as varied as you can too. For example, it's not necessarily bad to show a headshot, but if you show headshots on every single page, then it becomes very boring very fast. So instead, establishing shots are always a good way to vary the shot a little. And you don't need an excuse to sort of show what's going on in sort of an environment too. So you could just show a bunch of random people walking while the character's talking, essentially. You don't necessarily need to show the character while the character's talking, as long as we know who is talking, if you know what I mean. But yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about in regards to composition. If you like the video, like, subscribe. I'll probably make a video next week, Monday. See you then.